So welcome everybody. This evening we're pleased to host Erik Schlimmer, award-winning author and creator of the Trans Adirondack Route. During the past 30 years, Erik has explored the wildest places in America. Some of his trips include mountain biking across the United States twice, paddling the Delaware and Susquehanna rivers from source to sea, and climbing 3,000 mountains. The mountains he's most familiar with are the Adirondacks, a range he grew up in and then worked in as a backcountry ranger. Today we'll see 100 of his best photos from these mountains and learn more about the 240-mile Trans Adirondack Route, the East's wildest pathway. Please welcome Erik Schlimmer.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. If nobody shows up, these things don't happen. Now, I did ride my mountain bike across the United States twice, but that was a long time ago. Like, if you were to ask, like, invite me to do it again, no, I'm much smarter. This is like 20 years ago. And what I basically did, why I've been able to climb so many mountains and go on really big adventures, is I like to say that I did my retirement first. So during my 20s and 30s, I was kind of a dirtbag. I lived in the back of a super wagon, I built trails, I worked as a backcountry ranger. And then I turned 40 10 years ago and I woke up in a leaky tent and I was like, yeah, this would be a good time to get a real job. And so my real job, I'm a therapist by trade, but did most of my adventuring through my 20s, 30s, and into my mid-40s. One of the grandest adventures I've been on is the Trans Adirondack Route. So we're looking at the logo. We've got the green is the Adirondack Park, and then we've got that red squiggly line that goes across. The very brief history of this route is in 2010. I had a couple weeks off, and I was like, I don't think anybody's hiked from the northernmost part of the park to the southernmost part of the park. It has been done by a modern hiker. In 12 days and 240 miles later, I reached the southern border of the park. And that was really all it was supposed to be. I was supposed to go home, eat some Ben & Jerry's, clean out my gear, and call it done. And then somebody suggested this, and you know what, I bet somebody else would hike that. It sounds kind of cool. And so in 2013, the route officially opened for business. So now there's a website dedicated to it, and a guidebook, a map set, and we'll talk a little bit more about where the route is nowadays, and are people actually hiking this thing. That's the short history of it. So it was created in 2010 and opened for business in 2013. So what, it's been around 11 years now. So we'll look at some photos of the route, some photos not on the route. We'll talk about flora, fauna, history. I'm mostly known for decoding toponyms. So a toponym is just a name assigned to a natural feature. So you climb out Marcy, and then you go down to Johns Brook, and then you go fishing in Gooseneck Pond. I'm the guy who writes books about how did all these things get their names. I have one urban claim, one urban book, where I've decoded Albany's 800 street names. But mostly I stick to the mountains, because that's what I know best. So we'll look at a couple maps to begin with. So a pretty cool map. It's a satellite image of the Adirondack Park, and they've scraped off the vegetation and superimposed the bedrock. So we've got the Adirondacks in the middle, of course, and you can see it's surrounded by these massive waterways. Lake Champlain in the top right, named for Samuel de Champlain. He reached it in 1609. We've got Long Lake George kind of in the bottom right, around the 5 o'clock position. The very bottom, that kind of weird one where it's a lake with a squiggly on the upper right, Great Sacandaga Lake. And then you'll see Oneida Lake, I think it is, in the bottom left. And then there's that other chunk of bedrock that's not part of the Adirondacks, that's part of the Tug Hill Plateau. And then, of course, the St. Lawrence River and St. Lawrence Seaway up to the north. And you'll see that, it's interesting, the fault line kind of goes like this. It goes up to the northeast, and that's how almost all bodies of water and ranges trend. You don't really get anything going the opposite direction than that. All right, so the mountains. They're really, really old. It's the oldest rock on Earth, somewhere around 1 billion years. And that's why the Adirondacks are low and rounded. So you go down to the Andes in South America, you go to the Himalayas over in Asia, very high, very sharp because they're young mountains that they haven't had enough time to wear down. The Adirondacks are unique. There's nothing quite like it around there, so it's not part of the Catskills, the Buck Hill Plateau. It has most in common with the Canadian Shield, but it's even a little bit different than that. And we've got a lot of mountains, so 42 above 4,000, 217 above 3,000, and then a whopping 601 above 2,500 feet. Now, I don't give this presentation in Colorado where I live for a couple of reasons. And one, I would be laughed at boasting about peaks 2,500 feet tall. So we have a lot, they're not particularly tall, but the thing is they're very difficult, they're very remote, difficult mountains to access. And then we've got a whole bunch of water, about 30,000 miles worth of waterways. And then we have 5 rivers that exceed at least 100 miles, and they originate or are all in for its entire length. The Adirondacks, we've got the Black, the Grass, the Hudson, Oswegatchie, and the Racket, and then throw in another 12,000 bodies of water. Really impressive. 35 native species of trees, and a lot of trees too. Not counting babies, we're somewhere around 1.2 billion trees in the 6,000 in the entire park. Okay, so the bottom line: big, rugged, and wild. And we were talking about the trees. So now we have a completely different map than the bedrock map: vegetation. So the light green are hardwoods. So we've got maple, oak, aspen, all the deciduous trees. And then the darker green are the evergreens, some pine, some hemlock, but those are usually mixed in with the hardwoods. And you can see kind of in the middle, just up to the right of the middle, we have that great concentration of green because that's where the high peaks are. So basically all the land there is above 2,000 feet, soaring up to 2 peaks that go above 5,000 feet. All right, so the park itself, the state secured the first piece of land for the park in 1885. It was formed in 1892. 6 million acres, that's almost the exact size of Vermont or the exact size of Connecticut. Connecticut looks so much smaller on the map, but it's actually about the same size as Vermont. And it's this quilt work, this patchwork of public and private. So if you go to like Arches National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, it's just all land. Nobody lives in the park. But here, it's unique. So I grew up in Chestertown. I grew up in Warren County. And so I lived in the park, and it's sometimes difficult to explain to people who aren't from New York State because it doesn't really work like that in other places. It's like all land, federal, or all land, private. So it's somewhere around half and half nowadays. And then the state land is divided into like 10 or 11 different classifications, ranging from intensive use, the least wild, all the way up to wilderness. So the 2 most wild settings, we have wild forest, we have 17 of them, over 1 million acres. And then the most stringent classification, basically human powered travel only. It's kind of the only thing you can do in that land. 19 wilderness areas, and again, another 1 million acres. A lot of wild land up there. I like this figure, 20% of land, 1% of the population. One of my books over there is about settlement history and basically who showed up and who built the dams and who built the sawmills and the grist mills and stuff like that. And in the 1800s, a lot of these towns had 10, 20 times the population that they have today. And so a lot of these are basically ghost towns. There's one town out of the 92 towns in the park, Morehouse, very big, 80 people. And that is the second lowest population town in New York State. So it's old, it's big, and it's well protected. And if you wanted to, you could hike across the entire thing. So my 2010 trip, I started on the northern blue line, and you notice that the border is in blue. And you'll hear that used as a slang term. So someone's like, oh, I grew up inside the blue line. Or, going up to the blue line. It's because one of the original maps made of the Adirondack Park, the border was drawn in blue. Why this is a big deal, I don't really know, but it's a matter of tradition that it's always drawn in blue. Then we've got that squiggly line going all the way down. So a little bit about the route. 238 miles and climbs 25,000 vertical feet. But the vertical feet, that's actually not a lot. It's not much for 238 miles. It only goes over 3 mountains. Most of the time it's content going from lake to pond to swamp to lake to pond and along rivers. So if you look at the Vermont Long Trail, so it goes the entire length of Vermont, 30 miles longer, triple the vertical feet. So this is not a mountain route per se. It's mostly a lowland route. So the low end is still a little bit above 1,000 feet, and then it goes over Whiteface Mountain. That's probably about 9th highest, 8th highest peak in the state. That is a mighty mountain, beautiful. So there was nothing in, well, I shouldn't say there was nothing in place. There was no continuous route in place. So when I planned this trip, I had to look at trails and roads and old paths and just kind of piece it together, this little ribbon across 6 million acres. So right now, we've got 188 miles of trails. So just regular old hiking trails, 39 miles of roads. That's almost all in the north. It's like the first 2 days you get out of the way and you're in the woods the rest of the time. It's because there's basically no state land in the northern part of the park. And then we have 11 miles of trackless woods. I think those are 11 different sections ranging between 1/4 mile and 2 miles. So I may have a trail and then a road, and then I have to get over here to this other trail, but it's just, there's nothing there. It's just wild land. So I had to cut across using a map and a compass. So a grand tour of ecology, topography, history. It's a big hike. 60 bodies of water, 3 mountains, 8 wild forests, 5 wilderness areas, 3 small hamlets, that's the only size they come in, 17 towns, and 5 counties. And so this is designed for a backpacker who knows what they're doing. That is a very low success rate for a 238-mile trail. You would think it would be much higher. What you also have to keep in mind is that's reported. I think for every 10 people that try it, 6 don't make it to the other end, okay? Because somebody will email me to tell me they were successful. No one emails other people to declare their failures. It's probably around 40%. We have one person who did it in the winter. Great, I'm not gonna try it. One person, so we've had 3 attempts in winter. 1 person made it. Overall, we've had 60 and 32 made it. But again, that's reported. It's probably a 40% success rate. What's interesting is some of the people who failed are highly experienced long-distance hikers. 3 of them who didn't finish it had hiked the Triple Crown. So that would be the 2,200-mile Appalachian Trail, the 3,100-mile Continental Divide Trail, and the 2,700-mile Pacific Crest Trail. And what happened is they said, 238, please. And they got 100 miles in, and they were like, oh, yeah, this is very challenging. And they made it about halfway. So it's new-ish. That used to say new. It's new-ish. It's wild.
Did you purposely not mark the 11 miles?
I'm not allowed to, right? So we've got those 11 miles of off-trail. I'm not, like, you're not allowed to mark it. So I couldn't cut anything. I couldn't leave any ribbons, anything like that. It would be regarded as trash if I left ribbons and stuff like that. I do kind of, there's a guidebook over there to it, and I'll say, hey, this is the bearing, the compass bearing you're going to follow for 2 miles, and I'll give them some very clear clues as to how they're making progress. But that's what stops most people, because you'll get people who will hike like the Triple Crown at 7,200 miles. They've never navigated off trail before, and it's like a very quick learning curve. Yes, very good question. All right, so let's look at some images. And we'll start with spring. Oh, spring in the mountains. Yes. We're looking at the first mountain I ever climbed. It was 1985, and I was 12 years old, and I hated it. A bunch of adults dragged me up this godforsaken mountain, Crane Mountain in Warren County. It's a little over 3,000 feet, and it was pouring rain, and it was just not a good introduction. But here we are, 3,000 miles later, so I guess things got better. I spend about 15, almost 20% of my time when I decode toponyms in the mountains, why things are named the way they are, is I'm correcting other people's mistakes. A lot of people guess as to why something is named so. So I'll give you an example. I just wrote about a feature called Winch Pond, W-I-N-C-H. It's outside of Lake Placid. I stumbled across an article from a couple of years ago, and the author says, yeah, it's named for, the piece of hardware, a winch, that loggers would use for mechanical advantage to drag logs out. And to quote Thomas Sowell, I would say, well, I could be old-fashioned about it and ask for evidence. So a lot of people are just guessing, okay? 5 minutes of research, I found out the Winch Cemetery is 2 miles away. So a lot of people are guessing and don't do that, even if it's really obvious. So I've hiked down a road called Duck Pond Road. You would think it's named Duck with a pond. No, I met the widow of the husband it's named for, Mrs. Sarah Duck. Even Pond Ridge. There might be a pond up there, or it's the last name pond. Fish Lake. It's not named for the fish. The fish family lived near it. So you have to be extremely careful about this. Never guess. When it comes to this, I grew up near Crane Mountain, and people say, oh yeah, I know why it's named Crane Mountain. It's C-R-A-N-E. And it's named for the cranes, the giant birds that stop and nest and get a drink of water and then continue on their way. No. I have never, ever seen nor heard a crane in the Adirondacks. I've seen plenty of great blue heron, which kind of look like it. And then the story changed to, well, it's named for Moses Crane, the surveyor. No, it's not. It's named for a different surveyor of the name of Joseph Crane. So again, these stories are kind of circulating about why these features are named so. About 15 to 20% of the time, they're incorrect. Somebody's just guessing. And it's a very good guess. It makes sense. But when you look into it, it doesn't add up. The mountain is spelled P-E-A-K-E-D, but pronounced Peaked. Peaked. There's a lake with a big fork by Long Lake, F-O-R-K-E-D. Don't say forked. You'll look like a tourist. Forked. If you go down into the Hudson Valley, they have a town that is spelled the same as that city in Egypt. It's not Cairo. Cairo. If you go to Maine and you see the city, it's spelled the same as the big city in Spain. It's not Madrid. Madrid. Not Pulaski, Pulaski. And so there are all these weird pronunciations where you see something on paper, it's not pronounced that way. So though it's spelled peaked, which just means it's sharp, peaked, peaked. Just where snow got packed down in the winter and turned to ice, and ice takes longer to melt than snow. These can continue for several miles in the spring. One of the earlier wildflowers, painted trillium. There's also kind of like a blood red purple one, red trillium. The first one you'll probably see is trout lily. Really nice, delicate flower. It's about maybe the height of a can of Coke. And it gets its name from those speckled leaves. It looks like a speckled trout. So it looks like the side of a fish. Trout lily. Then there's stuff in the woods. I don't know what this stuff is. It just grows.
Northern tooth.
What is it?
Northern tooth.
Northern tooth. There we have it. Northern tooth. But I do know the tree it's growing on, and that's an American beech. B-E-E-C-H. A wicked hardwood. So beeches weren't harvested in the Adirondacks until the invention of the chainsaw. It's around 1950 you started seeing chainsaws in the woods. No, northern tooth. Northern tooth. Very good. Thank you. looking off to the high peaks, and we've got that green kind of crawling up. You can see the top of the hills are still brown, bottom very lush green. So again, we have these stories about how things get their names, and I'm like, it kind of makes sense, but I'm going to look into it, and it's usually wrong. I've always been interested in this pond. It's in the town of Johnsburg, not far from Gore Mountain, the ski hill. Our Pond, H-O-U-R. Our Pond. I really looked into it for like a year or two, and I learned things at presentations, just like I learned something already. And this guy came up to me afterwards, and he said, I know why Our Pond is named so. I grew up there. I'm like 4th generation local. I said, well, what's the story behind it? And he's like, it takes an hour to hike to. So I measured the trail. It's 1.8 miles. That's like exactly an hour. So I think he's correct. Our Pond takes an hour to get to. Very good. New York ferns, that's the actual name. The most common species I see is hay-scented. They all kind of look the same. You gotta look close. Hayes Pond, named for a settler family. And then we've got not quite high peaks, but some pretty big mountains in the back, getting up around 3,500 feet. A lot of names in the Adirondacks. It's about a third, somewhere around there, are named for critters. So number 1 is beaver. We have a lot of beaver toponyms. And then 2nd, 3rd, and 4th would be deer, moose, bear. So those are the 4 most common animal names: beaver, deer, moose, and bear. Only about 5% of features are named for flora. It's usually for animals, not many for plants, which is really surprising. Most features are named for their shapes, descriptive names. That's my favorite photo. Oh, this is a good name. We haven't spent much time on the route yet, but we'll get there. Spite and Dival Creek. Spite and Dival Creek, what the hell? So I had never heard of the term Spite and Dival until I was visiting my friend in the Hudson Valley. You get on the Metro North train, you take it down through New York City, and at least a couple of people are already shaking their heads yes. And you have this little robot computer lady on the train that tells you what the next stop is, and she goes, next stop, Spite and Dival. And I was like, what is Spite and Dival? I'd never heard of it. And they have Spite and Dival Creek, and then there's a little community, Spite and Dival. So this is what we call a transfer name. So it's a name that exists somewhere and ends up here. It's a long, complex story behind the Hudson Valley name that I don't have time for. How the hell it ended up in Faro Lake Wilderness area, almost 300 miles to the north, I'm not exactly sure. It's a Dutch term that means in spite of the devil. How it ended up here, no clue. Remnants of a deer kill when the snow melts, and I think we're moving into summer indeed. Here we are on the route. So only 25,000 vertical feet end to end. So the first hill, and we'll get a better photo of the hills in a second. You got to go over Whiteface Mountain. You go over Catabout Mountain, then you go over Whiteface Mountain, and then you go over this third mountain, Mount Van Hovenberg, named for a hotelier of the late 1800s. He was a local innkeeper. After you do these 3 peaks, now you're down in the low country for the rest of the route. If you can make it to mile 100, you're home free. Right? A lot of people quit around 80 or 90. It's really difficult, that section. Terrell Pond, this is on the route. It's called the Lake Country section. The route is cut into 7 different sections. So we've got Terrell Pond, natural sand beach. That is rare, with Terrell Mountain to the right, which is to the west. Again, the number 1 mammal named beaver. I don't think I could go on a long hike being a full day, and not see signs of the beaver. But it was at one point basically extirpated from the range. So extirpated means extinct in a certain region. Okay? At one point, there was one family of beavers left in the entire Adirondack range. What saved it from utter destruction is a change in taste. So most of the beaver pelts went over to Russia because you would have like a beaver hat, beaver shawl, beaver mittens, and stuff like that. And then there was a change in taste where everybody wanted silk from the Orient. So it was kind of lame to wear beaver, and that's what saved it probably from extinction in North America. Only about 2 miles from the very beginning of the hike. I like the very northern section of the route because I've never heard anybody say, and I know you haven't, you say, oh, where are you going hiking this weekend? I'm going hiking in the town of Ellenburg. It doesn't happen. Right? No one really goes to the very northern part of the park. Quite pretty. It's a high plateau. High for New York, it's about 1,900 feet. About flat as a pancake, but quite hot. Another peaked mountain, Farrow Lake Wilderness area. Whenever you see bare, bedrock, that stuff goes straight to China. Whenever you see that, one of two things is going on. One, the peak is so high that it has exceeded tree line. Out west, they call it timberline. And it's basically that limit where trees cannot grow anymore. It does have something to do with the weather, but it's mostly due to shallow soil. So they really can't grow above that. This one's really low. This peak's like 2,000 feet. So what happened? A wildfire swept over the summit. Wildfire swept over, it burned up the trees, but most importantly, it burned up the root system. And when the root system's gone, the next time it rains, it washes all the soil off the mountain and you're left with bedrock. So again, really high, above 5,000, or got burned over by a wildfire. So this is where it starts to get rugged. So behind me is the northern terminus of the route, 38 miles behind me. This is a dammed section of the Saranac River, Union Falls Pond. And now it gets pretty rugged because we have to go over the peak on the left. That's Catamount Mountain. There's no trail up. You kind of go through, get on top, take an incredibly steep trail down, and then you have to go over the 2 pointy peaks on the right. One is the shoulder of a mountain called Mount Esther. The other one is Whiteface. And Whiteface, to climb it, the vertical feet is on scale of stuff in Colorado. It's almost 4,000 vertical feet. When I was here, when I first hiked it, what would that be? Oh my God, 14 years ago, I was a bit more spry. I just did the whole thing in one day. I think it was almost 7,000 vertical feet. Slept very well that night. Rubble of an old mining operation. So what the Adirondacks has provided people with most of is iron. Okay? Iron was the most lucrative industry in the Adirondacks. Not far behind it is timber. There are rumors, like there were a couple small gold mines in Hamilton County, but nothing really big, only operated for a couple years. It was all about iron. So you find these dams all over the Adirondacks because they needed to redirect water, or at least concentrate it into a sluice to power machinery. That dam's from 1845. High Peaks section of the route, which is the 238 miles. We're about mile 90 to mile 115. That's the High Peak section. Goes through 4,000 foot peaks on either side, really dramatic. This is probably the most scenic part of the entire route. So we've got these bridges bolted into the bare rock face. Avalanche Lake is the body of water. Another view of Avalanche Lake, looking back, just walk down those boardwalks and looking back to where I came. From the top of Whiteface, 4,867 feet. And it's like 7 times, somewhere around there. Looking down on Lake Placid while storm clouds build. So again, it's about almost 4,000 vertical feet up. And then it's about 4,000 down, a real knee cruncher. Very steep, very steep. I camp a lot on summits. I do it out west, and I do it in the Adirondacks when I'm back here. Favorite thing to do. Bring up some water, bring up some food, set up a little camp, watch the sunset, wake up next morning for the sunrise. You're not going to see anybody either. I've never met a person who was also camping on a summit. I haven't seen it yet. Lookout Mountain. Good name. Loon Lake on the left, named for the bird. Back in Farrow Lake Wilderness area, probably about 20 of these photos are from Farrow. A lot of bald rock because the place got incinerated in 1903. Some really bad wildfires swept through. And we're looking at the high peaks. We had 42 peaks above 4,000, about 100 above 3,500. Park Mountain. Not sure why it's called that. It could be a last name. Haven't had the time to look into it. Ah, good name. I know this one though. Sprite Creek. Nothing to do with the soda. So Sprite is like, has anybody heard that word, Sprite? Yeah. It's like a ghost fairy type thing. It's where it got its name. You go here before it freezes solid. Let's say it's 15, 20 below, and the water is smoking. It's so cold. Yeah, reminded somebody of an apparition, ghost, fairy, something like that. Sprite Creek, way down in Fulton County, very southern Adirondacks, and it is on the route. Once you hit Sprite Creek, you only got 10 miles to go, if you're going southbound. Farrow Lake with Farrow Mountain out behind it. Named so because it rises like a king. It's the highest peak in a 530 square mile area. And it's not that it's that tall, it's only 2,500, it's just nothing else is tall. But that's really big, over 500 square miles, highest peak Texas. Very small, maybe the size of 2 pencil erasers. And this pond no longer exists. So the route goes through the bottom of those landslides that goes in that notch. There's like a notch in there. That's where Avalanche Lake is with those boardwalks bolted into the rock. So on the left we have Mount Colden, named for a New York socialite named David Colden. That kind of odd looking, kind of looks like 2 humps of a camel. Avalanche Mountain. And then again, in the notch between them, we've got, Avalanche Lake. There's a body of water called Marcy Pond. You have Marcy Brook coming down. He was dammed by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. And then we had Tropical Storm Irene. And it just filled it to the brim, and the whole thing blew out. They lost 3 dams in the backcountry in the high peaks. And it's fun to search online for it when the Department of Environmental Conservation, the storm passed and they were flying over the high peaks to see what the damage was. They have a great photo of a very big lake actually draining. The whole dam blew out and swept down the cold river. So this is now a grassy meadow, and so is the other one.
Is that called Duck Hole?
Yeah, this is Marcy Pond, so this one drained, and then the other one was Duck Hole. Yep. And that dam dated to the late 1800s. That was a logging dam by Santa Clara Lumber Company. And it just completely blew out. Picked up a lean-to, took that with it, kind of took everything with it. At least in the southern Adirondacks, we're in Fulton County. That's the last county you hike through on the Trans Adirondack Route. It follows about 60 miles worth of snowmobile trails. And I think out of the 30-odd through hikers we've had, no one has seen another hiker on the bottom 30 miles. So that's pretty cool. A lot of solitudes. Again, 30 hikers, didn't see anybody on the bottom 30 miles. On top of Dix Mountain, named for Civil War general and governor of New York. I think his middle name is Alden, John Alden Dix. Now you can learn a lot about the history of the land, flora, fauna, settlement, just by looking at the names on a map. And some of them don't make sense, and then you kind of learn a little bit more about the history and they make sense. So we're standing on top of Dick's, and then that very big lake with all those little islands is Elk Lake. Well, we don't have elk. Yeah, but when it was named, we did. So you can tell what critters used to live here that don't, okay? So we have a lot of features named for mountain lions. There's no native mountain lion population left. We have some elk toponyms. We have 2 caribou toponyms, but caribou never lived here. The closest they got was northern New Hampshire and northern Vermont. No evidence suggests they ever lived in the Adirondacks. But the guy who named it, the place was so pretty, he imagined caribou walking through it, and that's how it got its name. We do not have any grizzly toponyms. We don't have any wolverine toponyms. And a couple others that we don't have that people think lived here, but they didn't, okay? If we had, let's say, a grizzly toponym for some reason, it would probably be because the mountain looks like maybe the back hump of a grizzly bear or something like that. Okay, but definitely didn't live here. Oh yes, my favorite season. We'll move into autumn because it looks like this. So we have some red maples. That's where the red maple gets its name because it's that vibrant red. Red maple and sugar maple are very easy to tell apart with the leaves. So we have the lobes, the kind of parts that stick out. And sugar has 5, S-U-G-A-R. Red has 3, R-E-D. Red turns almost exclusively red. The maples are what really light up the woods. We've got that orange and yellow and red and sometimes purple. Absolutely amazing. Now that I live in Colorado, I've met a lot of native Coloradans, and they've never been out here. And I say, you have to come out here in the fall. It's kind of like seeing the Grand Canyon. It's like you really have to go to the Northeast sometime at peak fall foliage before you die. Long Lake, it's not the longest, but it's long enough to be called Long Lake, 13.9 miles. We have 7 long lakes, and some are only a quarter mile long, but it's longer than it is wide, so I guess it's a long lake. Oh, and there's Faro Mountain. Faro Mountain's original name was Bluebeard. That's a really good name, probably because it has a blue appearance from far away. Now it's called Faro because it rises like a king out of those 500 square miles. If there's not dramatic fall foliage, it looks like this. It's late October into November, early December. This is what the woods look like for about 2 months. Deer hunting season. The Kunjamak River, no one knows what that word means. It might be a Native American word, it might not be. And one has to be extremely cautious with supposed Indian names, Native American names, because research has revealed a lot of these were made up by daydreaming people of European descent. So the classic example, and we might have a photo of it later, is the highest peak in the state, Mount Marcy. It's one of 2 peaks above 5,000 feet. The next highest peak is down in Virginia, or you got to go over to New Hampshire. The vicious rumor going around is that it was called Tahowas, and Tahowas supposedly meant cloud splitter. And so now the story has developed that when the mountain was first climbed in 1837 and named for Governor William Leonard Marcy, that was like an affront to the Aboriginal name. It's like, no. They traced it down. It was written by the editor of the New York Mirror, and he attempted to do the second ascent of the mountain in 1837. He didn't make it. When you write a story for your readers, you don't want to say, I didn't make it up Mount Marcy. That's really boring. What sounds better is, I was defeated by the mighty Tahowas. It's actually a borrowed word from Central New York, and then others are really just made up. Now, there are a lot of totally legit Aboriginal names around the perimeter of the park because that's how they got around, right? You have Lake Champlain, you have the Mohawk, you have the Hudson, the Great Lakes. That's all correct. The ones deep into the interior, there's really no reason to go in there. Right? Most of the Aboriginal populations, they're going from somewhere better than the Adirondacks to somewhere else better than the Adirondacks, right? More game, more fish, better weather. T Lake. So if you go up on T Lake Mountain and look down, it's a giant capital T. And then if you go over to G Lake and do the same, well, yeah, that looks like a G. And then we also have an L Lake, capital letters, L, G, and T. Stevens Mountain. I don't know who it's named for. I haven't had time to look into it. A classic fall scene. So you get this low-lying fog in the morning. This isn't evening, it's morning. It only really happens during September and October. It's a certain weather pattern, certain humidity, certain temperature. It's quite common. This one's pretty good, but a couple times I've seen where the entire valley is covered and it looks like an ocean, like little islands popping up, and those are the tops of the mountains. Absolutely stunning. And this is what you get to see when you camp on top of summits. So spent the night up here. Crab ponds. So we do have like little wild crabs. They're like kind of like look like the ones you find in the ocean. And then we also have crayfish. Some people will call those crabs. So we've got Crab Mountain, and I believe that's number 8 hill. Number 8 hill. Why would it be called number 8 hill? So beginning around 1740, 1750, people started purchasing enormous tracts of land in the Adirondack Park. And at one point, that would be around the Revolutionary War, the entire park was privately owned. All of New York State. There was no hint of any public land at all. So what you would do is you would get a grant or a patent, and they're basically the same. So you would contact King George III and say, hey, I would like to buy 300,000 acres in upstate New York. And it would take about 4 years to process the paperwork. It was kind of expensive. The prices were rock bottom for land compared to land today, but eventually you would get it. Okay, the bad news is if you were on the British side of the Revolutionary War, you lost all your land. And that's how state land got created. So you were a Tory, you owned all this land, we won, and now we're taking your land. Most of them fled to Canada anyway. They didn't want their land back. But that was the beginning of state land. So why do we have number 8 hill? Well, you had to divide the land. So the biggest purchase was 3.7 million acres. 4 guys owned it. It was 10% of New York State. It was called McComb's Purchase. And what you would do, you would have to divide it up because maybe you could sell some of it. So you would first divide it into a township, which has nothing to do with modern towns. It wasn't political. It was just a land division, 25,000 acres each. And then maybe inside it, you'd have a grant. If it was a triangle piece, triangle-shaped piece of land, they called it a gore. That's how Gore Mountain got its name. And then eventually, the smallest measurement was a lot. Number 8 hill is in lot number 8, Scroon Lake Tract, Tottenham Crossfield Purchase. So that's the smallest up to the tract, up to the purchase. So almost, I think every numbered mountain I've researched is on that corresponding lot. So I recently decoded number 35 hill. Lot number 35, Great Tract 2, McComb's Purchase. Not very creative, but it gets the job done. Looking at Beaver Mountain, peak fall foliage. Oh, more beaver stuff. This is cool. A 5-tier beaver dam, which I've never seen before. Usually it's one big one. They have 1, 2, 3, and then there's 2 at back that are kind of difficult to see. Only seen this once. Nice. You can find great stuff in the woods. It's stamped on top. Pulteney, Vermont, 1845. That was a really good find. My friend has outdone me. He found a wood stove door in Massachusetts, stamped 1775. That was a really good find. 1845, not bad. This is in Indian Lake, Hamilton County. 1845 is very early to be bringing a wood stove up to the Adirondacks. It's very early, 1845. Peak fall foliage, again. I like that mountain on the right. I forget the name of it. Might be Zach Mountain. I don't know why it's called that. It's got that little evergreen cap on top, looking up at the high peaks. One of my favorite names is around here, Polaris Mountain, as in the North Star. Haven't had time to look into that one either. Back on the route, and we're hiking by what they call a beaver meadow. So this is what happens. You have just a regular section of woods, a forest with a stream running through it. A beaver is born, and when a beaver is adolescent, the adult beavers kick it out. You gotta go get your own place. Like they go off to college. So they go up and they dam. They make their own dam. They walk like a mile away, and they make their own dam. They make their own pond. It floods the forest, and all the trees die. So they're falling down, sinking to the bottom, disintegrating. Eventually, the beaver is going to die, or the dam is going to get blown out from a major storm. And what happens? Now all the water drains, just like those dams blew out. Those logging dams blew out, Duck Hole and Marcy Pond. And what we're left with is this. So in the beginning, it was a forest with a stream running through it. Dam is built, forest is killed, beaver dies, dam deteriorates, water drains, and you're left with this. There are hundreds, probably thousands of beaver meadows throughout the Adirondacks. Great for winter travel. You're in the woods, and there's all these down trees and sticks in your face, and then you come across this, and it's just, it's like a golf course. Snowshoe across it or ski across it, and have a really good time. Red maple leaf. Just outside of Speculator. Very gray day. A lot of days like this in the fall. Dunham Mountain, named for the Dunham settler family. Oh, yes. I just learned why this is named like last week. Extract Brook. Oh, what a name. Extract Brook. So immediately, I like guessing. Now, I don't guess and publish it. But I guess initially because, I don't know, it's kind of fun. Maybe I'll get it. I said, well, obviously iron. That's all they harvested in the Adirondacks. There was actually a tannery here. I just learned about this last week. So they would extract bark. Okay, so how tanneries worked is you had leather products, right? So you would have a bunch of skins from deer, and it's really tough. It's not pliable. So what they would do is there used to be a hemlock forest in here, and you would cut down the hemlock, you would fell the hemlock, cut off the bark, put it on a sleigh, because they did this during the winter usually, and then you'd take it down to the tannery, and you would extract this fluid out of the bark, which they would also call tan bark. And then you would tan the leather, condition it, make it pliable, it's going to last longer, and then you could sell it. So what they did, they extracted the hemlock bark along this waterway and got the tannin out of the bark. And there was a tannery at the bottom of this brook where it meets the lake. I did not know that. My guess was iron. It's a good guess, but it was wrong. Gooseneck Pond. Good name. Shaped like this, like a gooseneck. I like that little tree on the right. He's maybe a foot or two tall, and that's my favorite tree. And you nerd out if you have a favorite tree species. Is the eastern white pine. It's the state tree of Maine. It could be an entire other presentation why this tree is important. I'll give you the short course. So we have to go to just before the Revolutionary War. We have a bunch of colonists over, particularly in Maine, New Hampshire, all along New England. There were some people in the Adirondacks, not many, maybe southern Adirondacks, and a bunch of the Catskills, and this is eastern white pine country. Then we have the stamp tax and all these other taxes, and I'm all right, maybe we need to revolt. Well, what you needed back then was a navy. And of course, these ships had sails, and you needed a mast. And so the eastern white pine was also called the mast pine. So when the British came over, they saw all these magnificent eastern white pines that do not grow in Europe. And they're like, oh my God, this would be great for our navy. So they went around marking all the trees with an R for royal or an arrow. So you would do a couple chops with your hatchet or axe. and make an arrow, which was the king's broad arrow, which meant you were not allowed to cut down the tree. Well, you idiots, you just marked the best trees that we're all going to take to build our own navy. And the Revolutionary War started with gun battles up in Maine. There were a couple of people killed fighting over eastern white pines. And then, of course, the first battle was June 1775 at Bunker Hill. And I forgot to bring my baseball hat that I wear when I go hiking. I left it at my home in Colorado, but it has a little eastern white pine on it. And the first flag of the United States is on my hat, and it's an eastern white pine. And that was the original flag of our country before the Stars and Stripes. That's how important it was. So yeah, a mast pine, eastern white pine, really tall, really straight, and rot resistant. So moose poop. Moose were also extirpated, again, just eliminated from that area. The last moose shot in the Adirondacks was 1866, right around there. They're still not exactly sure who shot the last one. And then there were none. None in the range. Same with elk. We used to have elk, none in the range. And there were aggressive programs to bring it back, especially in the 1910s, 1920s. They did elk and moose, but they all got hunted. People just got rid of them again. Or they were hit by trains. There were a lot of logging trains back then. They were getting hit by trains and hunted. And then both reintroduction programs were abandoned. There are no elk in the Adirondacks. The closest elk are in Pennsylvania. We have about 1,300 moose because they started coming back on their own. Probably late 1970s, early 1980s. Swimming across Lake Champlain is nothing to a moose. I mean, every hair is hollow, so it floats. It's in the deer family. It has these hollow hairs, so it can easily swim across Lake Champlain, no problem. Or it just waits till it's frozen and comes over. Vermont has a lot more moose than we do, but again, we're up to somewhere around 1,300 right now. I've only found 2 moose antlers. And I've only seen 3 moose, so they're quite rare. I mean, 1,300 kind of sounds like a lot, but not if it's 6 million acres. So they have plenty of places to go. Another beaver meadow, another evergreen cap on a 2,700, 2,800 foot peak. It's called reindeer lichen. And reindeer, again, are the same as caribou. They've never lived in the Adirondacks. But that lichen, it's like these little plants that can break down rock, actually. This is what reindeer feed off of in far northern Canada. That's how it gets its name. It's the favorite food source of reindeer. Peak fall foliage again. I don't know if we'd call that a beaver meadow. It's more of a swamp. Faro Lake again. I've been up Faro maybe 10 times. I've camped maybe 30 nights at Faro Lake. And it's just a beautiful area. This is east of Schroon Lake, 43,000 acre wilderness, which is kind of small, but still. The Hudson River, just by Newcomb, and we're looking downstream. And this is not far from North River Mountains. And it's not far from the hamlet of North River. And then you're like scratching your head. You're like, well, what? It's not called the North River. It's called the Hudson River. Why aren't they the Hudson River Mountains? It's because the Hudson River used to be called the North River. It's had actually 12 different names. So it was called the North River because the Delaware River was already called the South River. So you'd have the South River, and then somebody said, let's call this the North River. Around 1800. And it's I don't know why. I haven't been able to figure this out. People started calling it the Hudson River because Henry Hudson went up in 1619. And I'm not sure why the name changed, but it did not gain universal acceptance. So mountain people are culturally isolated. It's just the way it is. I grew up in the mountains, right? So what happened is everybody kind of down the Hudson Valley, New York City, Long Island Sound area, and we're like, oh yeah, everybody's calling it the Hudson River. But as you went upstream, past the Catskills, past Albany, and started really getting into the mountains, people were unaware of the name change. So like the hamlet of North River, that was established in the late 1800s. Okay? They were already calling it the Hudson River at least 50 years before that time. So again, we've got the Hudson River and the North River Mountains and the hamlet of North River, as the Delaware was called the South River. That's a good rock. That's a good rock. I don't know anything about geology. I don't get rocks. They're rocks. Like, I'm not really into rocks, but that's a good rock. I'll call it a glacial erratic. So you see these like precariously balanced rocks. So the last ice age came down about 11,000, 13,000 years ago. I think it was called the Wisconsin period. And it came down, and the ice was so thick it covered Mount Marcy, which is over a mile high, and then it receded. And as it's receding and melting, you have all this debris falling off. And so you'd have like, a boulder half the size of this room on this ice, and the ice melts and it just kind of tumbles down. And some of them land in these precariously balanced positions. Buckhorn Mountain. Probably somebody found an antler up there. Buckhorn Mountain. There are about 4 buckhorns in the Adirondacks. Oh, in winter. It used to be my favorite season. I don't know if I'm getting soft or I'm just smart. Like, I don't camp when it's 30 below anymore. So I don't know if I'm smart or just getting a little soft, but it is gorgeous. You can see so far in the winter because of the low humidity. So even the best photos of the Adirondacks, unless they're doctored, it's like you really can't see that far. It has that permanent haze in spring, summer, and fall, but winter, really crisp due to the low humidity. Crane Mountain, that's that first mountain I went up. The peak on the right with that bald section, Moose Mountain. Somebody saw a moose on it, hunted a moose on it, something like that. But then you'll have Moose Head or Bear Head, Deer Head, Elephant Mountain. Those regard the shape. So if it was Moose Head, has to do with the shape. Moose Mountain, somebody had some interaction with the moose up there. Back on the route in Hamilton County, January, fall. Back on the route again, and this is the third image we've seen of those giant rock slides on the right, Mount Colden, named for New York socialite David Colden, Avalanche Mountain on the right, and then that notch in between, that's where we've got those boardwalks bolted into the rock face. We're standing at flowed lands. So we have some flows like haze flow and spear flow and flowed lands. And a flow is just a sluggish section of a waterway. So you'll have a river or stream come in, it hits a flat like this. It's still going, it's really hard to see, but it's still going. And then it empties out the other side. We'll call that a flow. First snow of the season, November 1st. High peaks out back, and this little pile of rocks they call a cairn, C-A-I-R-N, and it's to mark trails where there aren't trees. So back in the day, you would mark trails with your hatchet. You would do one slice down into the bark, and then the other like this, and the chip would fall out, and that was a blaze. It comes from the French term blazer, to bleed. So that's how they originally marked trails in the Adirondacks. Then we developed trail markers. And again, where there aren't trees, you would have these cairns. And for years, I was wondering, like, why is it called a cairn? I have never heard of that word. Cairn is a Scottish or Welsh word. So we'll have a mountain called, like, Blueberry Cobble. It's a very rocky, rugged-looking peak. Over in Europe, they'll call it Blueberry Cairn. So cairn is a small rocky peak. And so when you stack these rocks, you're building like a little cute miniature mountain. I don't know what's up with it. In certain sections of California, they call it a duck. D-U-C-K. Don't know where that comes from. California, you know, they always have to be different. Taken through a sunglass lens on the route not far from Whiteface Mountain. Oh yes, Lake, I forget the name. I've been in the slideshow 1,000 times. I forget the name of the lake. That's my friend Brian. He was the only person who would hike with me in winter because I do really difficult hikes. So I'm standing on the shore of this lake and we were looking out, and I'm very cautious on lake ice. It's like, you do not want to mess around with that. I'm just kind of standing. What's that?
Is it Rock Lake?
No, it's not Rock Lake. It starts with a K, and it's just outside of Saranac Lake, and it sounds like an Aboriginal word, but I always forget it, so please forgive me. So we're standing on the shore, kind of like, you know, we could cross it, you know, we could stay far apart, and you know, you're like jumping on the ice like a foot from shore, which tells you absolutely nothing. And then out of nowhere, this redneck just comes friggin' blasting down out of the woods on his four-wheeler and just, and we were like, nice. And then we waited. We made it to the other side, so now we go out. A very, very nice part of the Adirondacks near the route. A lot of hiking done in winter, and it depends on the snow conditions, but you could actually sometimes move faster than in summer. If it sets up really firm, you can go really fast. About 90% of my hiking I did on snowshoes, about 10% on skis. This is a section of route which is really cool. It's the abandoned 1932 Olympic cross-country ski course. And locals kind of keep it open. It uses 3 miles, and I think they had a 40-kilometer route for the 1932 Olympics. It uses 3 miles of it. So low land on skis, it's generally faster. Once you start getting into rugged terrain, just put your snowshoes on. You can ski down it if you're really good. Very difficult to navigate up, especially when there are no trails. Great trip. So it's very nice when you go out. It's just a, you know, a regular trip, a really nice trip, whatever, nothing special. And I got to this area and didn't realize there was an ice storm the night before. So this is one of those ice storms, you know, you have a branch the size of your pinky and it has, you know, ice on it like this, almost the size of like a Red Bull can. So the next couple of photos could probably just speak for themselves. Absolutely gorgeous. And what you'll need that warmer weather overnight, and then it has to just freeze quickly before the sun rises. A high of only about 10 degrees on this trip, but crystal clear.
Is that Lake Kawasa?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yep. Yeah, Kawasa? Kawasa? Thanks. Yep, Lake Kawasa. Looks like Utah or Colorado. Really, really nice. Middle of the Adirondacks, right next to the route, not on it, maybe a mile away. But most of the time it looks like this. Heavy snow, deep snow. I was recently talking to a Coloradan from Aspen, and he was asking me about the Northeast Mountains. He hasn't been here, and he got this expression on his face like he was smelling rotten chicken. And he goes, yeah, I hear like when it snows there, does it like stay on the ground? And it's like, yes, for like 6 months. I live in Colorado Springs. I've shoveled once since I moved there. And I kind of looked, I was like the new guy from New York. They're like, look at this idiot from New York, because it snowed a foot in my neighborhood. And I was out there shoveling because I have a good work ethic. And I was criticizing my neighbors. I was like, look at all these lazy people. No one's out here shoveling. This is ridiculous. and you don't shovel because it melts in 2 days. So like, nobody owns a snowblower. Maybe you own a shovel. You just wait around 2 days and it melts away. But yes, I informed them it stays on the ground and it is here a very long time. Yeah, 6 months, 7 months up in the mountains. When you go up a bit higher, again, a lot of snow, a lot of trees. And as you're going up, you get more trees per acre. So it's getting thicker and denser and thicker and denser. And the snow is falling and it's so dense the snow really doesn't reach the ground. And then up around 3,500 feet, it just looks like this. And I look at photos like this and I'm like, what was that thing? You know? About stuff like this, half mile, an hour. And this is with 2 people just trying to sneak their way through. Really difficult, above 3,500 in winter. But then, hey, you go down, you got these frozen lakes, put your skis back on, and you can cruise pretty fast. Mackenzie Lake, named for another settler family. This is just outside of Saranac Lake, about 5 miles from the route. MacNaughton Mountain. Its original name was Henderson. There are a lot of mistakes on maps when the federal government, USGS, United States Geological Survey, started publishing maps of the Adirondacks in 1894 was the first map. They inadvertently switched a bunch of names. I have a website where I dedicate my time to decoding Adirondack toponyms. I have a whole page, and it's very long, of mistakes on maps. So the name was put over here, wrong mountain, this one got switched, this one spelled incorrectly, this one should be over that river. Mistakes on maps are a lot more common than people think, but you would never know looking at it. You just presume it's correct. So MacNaughton was called Henderson, Henderson was called MacNaughton. Somebody switched them, totally inexplicable. Standing on top of Nipple Top Mountain, if you were looking at it from a couple miles away, you would totally get it. And then about 2 miles north of here is another Nipple Top Mountain. Some vacationers in Keene Valley, in the town of Keene, found it offensive, and they tried to get it changed, but the locals were too in love with the name. The very white dome just left of center, that's Mount Marcy. Again, highest peak in the state, next highest one, Virginia or New Hampshire. Sawtooth Mountains, great name. So rugged, it looks like the teeth on a cross-cut saw. There have been naming efforts to try to get individual peaks named. It never worked. Just the whole range is called the Sawtooth Mountains. In the Sawtooth Mountains, maybe a half mile from the route. It's at the bottom of this hill, runs along the stream. A paper birch forest, this is indicative of a wildfire. So usually the top, when it burns, you get bare rock. The sides usually burn up, and you'll get first pin cherry, but that's not a very long living tree, and then what pops up, paper birch. So if you see a beautiful paper birch forest, it's almost guaranteed that that place got burned over probably 40 years earlier. At Scott Pond, about 2 miles from the route. So a hunter chased a moose up here, lost it, discovered this pond, never made it back, couldn't find it again. The next hunter found the pond and named it for its discoverer. We've got Algonquin Peak on the left, that kind of white one that blends into the sky. Boundary Peak in the middle, Iroquois Peak on the right. Mighty Whiteface Mountain, high peak of the route, 4,867 feet. So if you're hiking south on the route, you're going to go up the backside. That's at 4,000 vertical foot climb. It's just enormous. And then you go barreling down this side, 3,500 feet, and you hit Lake Placid at the bottom. It's really nice. Alpenglow. You don't see this much in the east. It's mostly a western thing. So we have the sun setting out to our left, the west, and what happens is you have a cloud bank and you have the horizon. And then when the sun comes down, it's got this little little section to shine. And so you get this narrow beam on the mountains. Quite rare. We've got the highest point on the left, Sentinel Mountain, in the Sentinel Range, because it stands like a sentinel, like a watchman, like a guard. Rises over 3,000 vertical feet on the left side and over 2,000 vertical feet on the right side. It was named by locals in the late 1800s. Miserable January thaw. You get weather like this, it's like 35 and rain for a couple days. That's a lot of snow. That's probably 4 feet of snow, but the apex of that roof is probably 7.5 feet tall. So yeah, that's a good 3 or 4 feet of snow. Right by T Lake. We talked about T Lake before. You go up on T Lake Mountain, makes a big capital T. Back in the Sawtooth Mountains, very rugged, and the route runs between this range and that mountain way out there. Those are the Seward Mountains, named for a New York State governor of the 1800s. Sawtooth, Sewards, and the route is down in that valley between. Really, really nice area. On the route again, just outside of Long Lake. Exact halfway point. That's why this photo was taken. Exact halfway point. Camping in the high peaks. So everybody has their own opinion on what shelter is best. I think this one is best for winter. So if you bring out a tent in the winter, as you're breathing inside it, you get all this condensation that builds up inside the shelter, and that just turns to frost, and then like you bump into it, and all the frost falls on your stuff, and it's kind of clammy and stinky, and I'm not a fan of tents. I very rarely use a tent. This is called a Mega Mid shelter. It's made by Black Diamond. Black Diamond makes backcountry ski equipment and climbing gear. And the cool thing about it, it does not have a floor. So what you do, and you can see that the edges of it don't go flush on the ground. So you have this air circulating. So you go with your snowshoes, stamp down the snow the best you can, and then you leave it for like 20 minutes. And what's going to happen, the crystals that you broke are going to bond to each other and make it nice and firm. You lay down a tarp, extend the pole, it's got a pole in the middle, and then you set this thing up. Kind of looks like a little circus tent. Right? A tent might be a couple degrees warmer, but you're going to lose that in condensation. It's just going to feel damp in there, and then you're going to feel colder. So I'm a fan of this. Packs down like a loaf of bread. Really nice. May have the same material that a parachute would. Very thin, very light material. If it's not winter, I just use a tarp, and I string it up like a low A-frame. Weighs less than 1 pound, and that's my entire shelter. Looking toward the Green Mountains of Vermont. Again, the name Vermont itself, Green Mountains, Vermont. And then we have Lake Champlain. You can't see it in the foreground. Again, named for the father and new friend Samuel de Champlain. I'm on top of Wyman Mountain, named for the Wyman family of that part. They settled it right around 1840 and opened a tavern at the base of the mountain. So you've got Wyman Mountain. A couple miles up that way is Wyman Hill. So sometimes you'll have repeated names because of the influence of the family. Their last image is Van Dorian Mountain, but first about that lake. Well, even before that. So on the left, we have the Seward Mountains, named for a governor. The route is right below and to the left a little bit. But we've got that weird looking pond. It's called Ampersand Pond. Ampersand is that weird and symbol. It's above the 8 on your keyboard. It's that thing nobody uses. And the theory was, and I guess it was reported as fact more than a theory, is that the brook that came out of it, Ampersand Brook, was so convoluted that it looked like an ampersand. That's probably not the case. It's probably what we call a name corruption. Okay. The lake has amber sand, and then it becomes ampersand. And this happens all the time. So I hiked up to Masher Vly, which is a swamp in Fulton County. Masher Vly, why would we call Masher Vly? I nerd out on this stuff, so when I leave, I stop at any little cemetery nearby. Maybe it has a connection to the land. The first cemetery I stop at is the Mosier Cemetery. You get this all the time, mostly because of the oldie-timey cursive handwriting they use. It's like you look at it, you're like, is that a U or a V or a W? Is this an O? Is this an A? Everything kind of blends in. You had quite a few illiterate people, and then you also had immigrants from other countries, and then they just had these weird accents. So they would tell you what it was, and the surveyor thought he heard this when he didn't. So we call that a name corruption. So amber sand became ampersand. And then the mountain that we're on is Van Dorian Mountain, named for Sophus Von Dorian. So I guess that's a corruption. Somebody confused the A with the O. The mountain was named probably 1885 by state surveyor Verplanck Colvin. So Verplanck Colvin, anybody who knows anything about Adirondack history, they would know the name Verplanck Colvin. He was a famous surveyor. He named scores of features, made first ascents of high peaks, corrected past surveyors' mistakes, and he's the guy who suggested, hey, we should make this a park. So he was promoting this idea in the halls of Albany. He said, well, I don't know if they're just going to listen to me. I need like some kind of expert. And he knew Sophus Von Dorian, and Sophus Von Dorian is a forester, but more important than that, he was a forester from Germany. Okay? And the Germans are excellent foresters. By 1700, they had forestry programs all over the country. It took us another 150 years to get that here in the United States. So he said, hey, Sophus, you have to help me out. I really don't know a lot about forestry. If you could maybe write me a letter or something, I can bring it to Albany and you can explain why my idea is a good idea. And he did that. It was a 48-page letter basically describing how forestry works, how they do it in Germany. And then Sophus says, yeah, Verplanck Colvin is totally right. Because what's going to happen if you don't preserve the mountains, and especially the forests? What's going to happen is you're going to cut down everything, it's going to rain, all the soil, sediment, clay, mud is going to wash into the streams, that's going to go into a river, and that's going to go down to Albany, and the current isn't swift enough, and then it's going to build up mud, and your commerce is going to grind to a halt. Mark my words. And that was one of the major movements behind creation of the park, was to keep the waterways free of sediment. So Sophus Von Dorian is certainly worthy of having this 3,000-foot peak named for him. Now, the best book written about the Adirondacks is Adirondack Country by William Chapman White. It was written in 1957, I think, somewhere around there. We can end with a quote from this. It's probably the best Adirondack quote out there, from the best book out there. As a man tramps the woods to the lake, he knows he will find pines and lilies, blue heron and golden shiners, shadows on the rocks and the flint of light on the wavelets, just as they were in the summer of 1354, as they will be in 2054 and beyond. He can stand on a rock by the shore and be in a past he could not have known, in a future he will never see. He could be part of time that was and time yet to come. So he chose 54 because it was written in 1954. But that is the beauty about going to these really remote sections in the park, whether it's on the Trans Adirondack Route or otherwise, is when you don't see any signs of civilization. It could be 1300. It could be 2100. You have absolutely no idea what year it is. And so it is timeless. Yeah. If you like to read, and you like to read about the Adirondacks, especially, hands down, best book, Adirondack Country, William Chapman White, since deceased. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have not heard anything about Herkimer County.
Yes.
Was it not included for a reason, or wasn't part, it's not?
Right. Yep. So Herkimer County is more in the western Adirondacks.
Right.
The route goes down the dead center of it. So we've got Clinton, Franklin, Essex, Hamilton, it's west of Warren, and Fulton. Yeah, Herkimer, and Herkimer has this kind of neat shape. It's very, very long. Yeah, Herkimer County does not enter Herkimer County. And I haven't hiked much out there. I have hiked in Herkimer County, but when I lived here, I was living in the eastern Adirondacks, so that's where most of my efforts were concentrated.
Okay.
Any questions? No. As always, thank you for attending, and I'm always the last one to leave the room. You want to come up and talk to me, I'd love to talk to you.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
So when they're doing the Trans Adirondack,
Yeah.
you can't go anymore. Like, where do you go? Like, how do you get? Like, you know,
Right.
you're like, I'm done, but
Yeah.
aren't you kind of in the middle of?
You're in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you go up? Do you go? You know, like, you can't just continue until it gets better.
Right. The closest bus station is Gloversville, but that's 40 miles away. And if you hike 240 miles, the last thing you want to hike is 40 miles.
Yeah.
Right? I think almost everybody, so we've got 32 through hikers. I think almost everybody had somebody pick them up.
Mm-hmm.
When I first did it, I left my car at the end because I know a retired forester who lives a quarter mile from the end. So I went down there, dropped off my car, got a ride to the beginning, which was only 8 miles from the Canadian border, and then hiked all the way down to my vehicle. And then I thanked him, and then he was in especially good mood because I opened my trunk and I had a case of beer for him as payment. So I said, oh, I should do this more often. Most people will call a friend, so they'll say, hey, meet me. If you don't hear from me, let's do the 18th at noon. And as they're going, they can get cell service here and there. You can get it on top of those 3 peaks. And as you kind of near the southern terminus, there are some cell phone towers outside of the park. And so you can keep updating. I left my vehicle because it was in somebody's yard. Okay, I don't think I would leave a vehicle there for 2 weeks unattended. And most people will get a ride. Yeah, there's actually it's crazy. There's public transportation within a mile of the beginning. Yeah, it's Clinton County, rural transportation, whatever. So to finally answer your question, most people get picked up.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the southern terminus?
The southern terminus is in the town of Stratford, which is in Fulton County. It's 40 miles west of Gloversville. And that's kind of the complete description because there's just kind of nothing out there. It is kind of cool, and it goes precisely from blue line to blue line. So the northern terminus, it's exactly a quarter mile north of the post office in Ellenberg Center. And there's a little sign that says Ellenberg Center. And somebody knew that was the border of the park because it's beyond coincidence that the sign would be there. When you get down to the end, it's on a road, and there's a house here and a house here. And you can see a super old stone wall. And it doesn't go straight across. It goes kind of at an angle. And if you look at the bottom border of the park, it does go at an angle. So God only knows how long that stone wall has been there, but that's the final marker. Like when you reach it, it's totally official.
The Poly Road or
What's that?
the Poly Road in Stratford or
It's I forget the exact name of the road, though I should know. I forget. Town of Stratford, Fulton County, 40 miles west of Gloversville. It's also, if you look at the border of the park, I wanted to make the route across the entire park, so I chose the 2 points that are farthest from each other. So yeah, if you hike to the southernmost part of the blue line, that's where it is. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a favorite part or a favorite section of the route?
Yeah, I do. So it's broken into 7 sections. My favorite, no one likes. And it's the foothills section. It's the bottom section. So you've got these 7 named sections. Foothills is the last 40 miles. There are no big lakes. There are no peaks that you go over. A lot of it is on snowmobile trails. but that's the southern 30 miles where no one has ever seen another person, and that's kind of my thing. Right? And it's so a lot of there aren't really any other hikers there, and I like solitude. Again, I've hiked a lot of mountains, and it's like it's not getting old, but it's like if it's flat, it's fine. If it's easy, I'm a big fan of that at this point in my life. So after doing the vertical feet and the off-trail travel and over white face and down white face and through the swamps and all that stuff, it's a nice, gentle end. The both times I've done it, I went southbound, and I really enjoyed that 40-mile bottom foothills section. Really nice. Yeah, really pretty.
How frequently would you have to surface to replenish your supplies?
Well, this is convenient. That's a good question. So the only practical option is at mile 120. So we've got 238 miles. So wow, look at that. Mile 20, exactly halfway, is the hamlet of Long Lake in Hamilton County. So you come down through the high peaks. I think it's 28N paved road that you cross. And you can walk 2 miles into Long Lake where there's a seasonal grocery store. There's a Stewart's, so you can get your mint cookie crumble. And then you get your junk food and you go back out the 2 miles and continue. What some people do, and I'm not a fan, it never works out. I also list post offices along the route. So this is common with long distance hikers. They'll get a box of food and they mail it to the post office and they write on it general delivery. So when you send something to a post office general delivery, the post office has to hold it for 30 days. So they're doing that as a resupply, but I've done that many times. It always gets screwed up. The box gets lost, somebody backs it over with the Postal Service little vehicle they have, or it arrives on a Sunday, or you arrive on a Sunday. And it's like, it never works out. I've done this several times, and every time I get there and it's closed, and I'm like, oh, it's Memorial Day. Like, it's just a pain in the ass. But the grocery store in Long Lake, I know is open. I know it has standard hours, and I can go there and do it. And people are averaging 15 miles a day. So you would only need maybe 1 week of food at maybe 1.5 pounds of food a day. You won't run out of food if you do 1.5 pounds a day. So it's not that heavy. Another resupply is Lake Placid, but that's only like 60 miles in. It's like you might as well just keep going. So Long Lake is perfect, 2 miles off the route, exactly halfway. Nice. Any other questions?
What brings you to this area now?
Yeah, this is like a business pleasure call. So each year I do at least 3 100-mile hikes. So I was recently in Arizona, I was recently in Texas, I was recently in New Mexico, in Colorado. And there's a trail in the northwest part of the Adirondack Park that goes around Cranberry Lake 50. So I was like, oh, 50 times 2 is 100, I'll just hike it twice. I've been checking the weather, I might just go home. Because I think it's gonna rain for 5 days straight. And it's like, I don't know if I really want to hike in the rain for 5 days. So I keep checking the forecast on my phone. If it's nice, it's like, come on, Eric, suck it up. You can do this, hike 100 miles and go back. So it is a business / pleasure / maybe hike 100 miles. I come back to New York about once every 5 years. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be the last one to leave the room if you want to talk. Thanks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.